Hello everyone, it's John Literal here. I just want to make a video and talk about some things that I've been hearing lately from David Icke. And I heard him on a podcast here recently talking about religion, talking about Christianity, and talking about the Bible. And he's made some claims that I want to respond to. Now, before I get started in this, I do want to say that I've been a big fan of David Icke for a lot of years. I've really benefited from his books. I've listened to just countless videos of his. And I even actually got the interviewing some years ago on a podcast. And, that was definitely one of the highlights of when I did some podcasting. And so I've got a great deal of respect for him. And a lot of times I find myself gravitating and agreeing with a lot of the things that he does say. But some of the things that I've heard recently, like I said, him talking about Christianity and the Bible and stuff, I do want to kind of respond to that and give my perspective on things that when I heard what he said, I just knew that he was just flat out wrong about some things. Now, everything that he said, even though that it may have not been favorable toward Christianity, doesn't mean that I claim that everything that he said was wrong about it. But there are some things that I do want to point out that I do know he was wrong about. And some of the things that he said it really disappoints me, because he's made some claims about Christianity and the authorship of the Bible and stuff that it was just poor data and information that he's relying upon. And to be quite honest with you, some of the things he said had come from just people that claim to be scholars, but they're really just crackpots. And especially by some of the things that they were saying. And I'll get into that here in a second. Now, this video that I'm making here, I'm not coming in with a bunch of notes or with a lot of preparations. I've just listened to the video twice that I'm talking about. That had David Icke being interviewed. And so I didn't take notes. This is just kind of like talking just off the top of my head here. But, I've been researching and studying the Bible for nearly 30 years now. And I've written and published nearly 30 books. And most of those books have been Christian resources, Bible commentaries, and different Christian study tools. And I've even put together a study Bible called the Early Church Father Study Bible. I have translated and published many Bible commentaries from the Greek and Latin Church Fathers, and put together, works on the Gospels. And on top of that, I have written and published 3 books on the Illuminati as well. And so, so one of the things that David Icke repeated in this interview that I want to point out is that he claims that Christians don't even know who wrote the Gospels, much less the authorship of all the other books of the Bible. Now, keep in mind, the Bible is a book made up of a number of different books. You have 2 sections. You got the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament are all the writings that were written before Christ, and the New Testament are all the books that were written after Christ. And so Christ came around 2,000 years ago. That's the belief in Christianity. Now, he claims definitely that nobody knows who wrote the books of the Old Testament. Now, that can be debatable. Now, there's a big process between the very time that the authors wrote their original writings to the point that we have the text now. There's been a lot from the time of the autograph to all the period in between with the people who copied those writings to the present text we have today. There is a large process. There's a process of translations and transmission. I'm not going to get into all that, but the same way with the New Testament. Now, since the New Testament is not as old as the writings of the Old Testament, now we have a lot of evidence, we have a lot of documentation when it comes to the writings of the New Testament. We have a good idea on who a lot of the authors of the New Testament were. And so when David Icke would say, ask any Christian about who the authors of the Gospels were, he'd be like, oh, you'll just get silence. And that's not the case. Now, yes, there is unfortunately a lot of Christians. There's a lot of people, even clergymen, who are unfortunately not very educated when it comes to the transmission of the Bible. And so, yeah, there will be some, obviously, some Christians that will not know who the authors of the New Testament books and the New Testament, or the authors of the New Testament, or the Gospels are. Yeah, you may get silence from some Christians. But people who do research this and study this, like myself, like I said, I've been doing this for a lot of years now. And, some of us do know who these authors are. And just like the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can pretty well state with full confidence that we know who the authors are of the Gospels. Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. So how do we know this? How do we know for sure? Now, the way that David Icke would present the Bible is that, this is just a book and that Christianity came from the New Testament and came from these writings, but that's not the case. And unfortunately, like I said, there's a lot of Christians that don't understand how the Bible was put together, how, that it was written, how it was transmitted over time, from the time of the autograph when the authors originally wrote it, through the period of times throughout the centuries as people would copy, call them scribes, copyists, or whatever. They would copy them to preserve them. Then there were times where, from the original time they were written, like the New Testament, originally written in Greek, there were times that it was translated in ancient times, ancient translations, like translated into Latin, called the Latin Vulgate, or the Old Latin. Also, you have the Old Latin manuscripts. It was also translated into an Aramaic dialect called Syriac. It was also translated in Armenian. It was translated into Coptic. So there are very ancient translations of the New Testament books as well. And then, so you have all these years, all those centuries of these writings being copied. And yes, granted, we don't actually have the autograph, the original writing from the writers themselves, because just the age of it, and it's just just the wear and tear over time. We don't have any surviving autographed copies. Well, we have copies, but we don't have the original writing manuscript themselves from the original authors. But we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of ancient copies of the Old and New Testament books in their original languages. We have ancient copies of the Old Testament in the Hebrew, the very early translation where the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, and we have very early translations as well. And like I said, we've got thousands of copies of these. But here's the thing about the Bible. The Bible didn't fall out of the sky from heaven one day. It didn't just all of a sudden appear. And that's the way David Icke would present this. Like, all of a sudden you got the Gospels, and then as if Christianity came from these writings. But that's not the case. Now, I'm going to give you some bit of information that David Icke never even mentioned, and unfortunately, even a lot of Christians don't even know this. We have, when it comes to Christianity and documentation, we have what is called patristic writings. We have writings from ancient Christians. And this goes back, these writings and these, what I call early church fathers, they're called early church fathers, it goes all the way back to the times of the apostles. We actually have writings from men who were appointed, who were baptized and taught by the apostles themselves. We have such as Polycarp, who was taught by the apostle John. We have writings from Ignatius of Antioch, who lived during the times of the apostles, worked right along with the apostles. We have also Justin Martyr. He was right along that period of time. He's considered one of the apostolic fathers. We have Clement, who's even mentioned in the Bible. We have at least one letter of his. First, he wrote a letter to the Corinthians. So we actually have writings that go from men who were taught by the apostles themselves. And you can access them freely online. We've got ancient manuscripts of theirs. And we have them, translations of them. And you can read works and writings from men who were during the times of the apostles. Then we have each and every generation from the times of the apostles, we have writings from men from each succeeding generation, going all the way back to the apostles. And that's one of the great things. That's one of the things that I love about the early church fathers is we have this succession of writings, succession of men from the times of the apostles all the way to the present time, actually. There is no other entity, there's no other religion, there's nothing that has the kind of documentation that Christianity has. So what makes these early church fathers so important is what they passed on, the traditions that they passed on. And I'm not talking about traditions of doctrines, because I'm not somebody that is big on dogma and doctrines and so on. But to me, what makes these writings of the early church fathers so important is, yes, these are writings from men that you can trace all the way back to the times of the apostles. And yes, this is how we know who wrote who in the New Testament. That's one of the reasons why we know John wrote the Gospel of John. Why we know that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Why we know that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. Why we know that Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and that we know that he wrote also the Acts of the Apostles. We know the writings that Paul wrote. And we also know James wrote James. We know that Peter wrote 2 letters called 1st and 2nd Peter. We also know the same John that wrote the Gospel of John wrote 3 letters called 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And that we also know that he wrote the book of Revelation. How do we know this? Because we have writings from men that go all the way back to that time. See, Christianity is not just a religion of a book. We don't have Christianity because we have the Bible. Christianity existed before the Bible was even put together. And this is something that, unfortunately, a lot of Christians do not understand. But getting back to David Icke and some of the claims that he made, he says it takes more faith to believe this than it actually does to believe what we know about the authorship of the books and stuff. He made the crackpot claim, and this comes from some crackpot pseudo-scholars claiming that the Gospels were written by Josephus and some people that Josephus worked along with. There's absolutely zero evidence to prove that. But that's unfortunately one of the things that David Icke is going around and claiming. He didn't make that up. There are some, like I said, pseudo-scholars that's making that claim. And I think he also said that when it comes to Paul's epistles in the New Testament, that it was written by Pliny, I think he said Pliny the Elder, there's absolutely zero evidence of that. So, again, when it comes to Christianity and documentation, you're not going to find any religion, you're not going to find anything in the ancient world that has all the evidence and all the documentation that Christianity has. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity doesn't have its, fair share of problems and issues and so on. In fact, I do talk about that a lot, and I know that I'm probably make a lot of Christians mad by some of the things that I say. But that's one thing that I can definitely claim is all the evidence and all the documentation that backs up the authenticity of the writings in the New Testament. And same way with the Old Testament. Unfortunately, the Old Testament is way older, especially some of the books of the Old Testament are much older. We're talking, we're going even 1,000 years and more before the New Testament was even written. So that's pretty old, and it's a little harder to determine some of the Old Testament books, but we do have an idea about who wrote what in the Old Testament. I wrote an essay on this a little while back, where I wrote an essay on who wrote the Bible, how it was transmitted over time, and to the present form that we have today. And, sad to say, over the years, I've heard people make claims about where the Bible come from. I've heard some of the most ridiculous claims, some of the most ignorant claims that you can ever possibly imagine. I've heard some people say, King James wrote the Bible, or, that Constantine wrote the Bible, or whatever. Or that's another thing actually that David Icke claims, and I'll talk about here in a minute. He claims that Constantine invented Christianity, and I've heard people say that as well. And that's something I will clarify. I've even written about this in 3 of my books on the Illuminati. But when it comes to the authorship of the Bible, the authenticity of the authorship of the New Testament and authenticity and stuff, again, the place to go to, if you're not familiar with the early church fathers, leave a comment in the comment section and request information on that. I'll give you all the links and resources that you can that you would need, because again, I've not only read them, the early church fathers, I have translated some of these myself and have published these in English translations. And so that's something that I do know a fair share about. So anybody that's saying, claims that we don't know who really wrote the books of the Bible and all that, there's plenty of evidence that you can that combats that. Now, when it comes to Constantine, and I'm going to share my perspective on this, and I know that this may make some Christians mad. They may not like this. But Constantine, this was a time where Christianity, unfortunately, in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, Christianity became institutionalized. At least part of it did. And what happened was, as this was a time, Constantine, he was the Roman emperor. He was a Flavian, were a cultist, and he took where Christianity was very decentralized at the time. He did his best to institutionalize it and to bring all Christians under one umbrella. And so keep in mind, Council of Nicaea didn't start because a bunch of Christian bishops decided to get together and unify Christianity. Council of Nicaea came about because a Roman emperor demanded it. Again, this was not a choice made by the bishops. Bishops were called to this council and held under duress and this was a time where Christian bishops merged with the ruling class of the Roman Empire, and binding dogma was declared. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's not a good thing. That's not to say that everything in Council of Nicaea, it's not to say that some of the teachings and some of the things that were defined as doctrines was necessarily all bad, but the fact that it made political enemies out of anybody who did not agree exactly with what was defined by the priest class and ruling class, that's where I had my issues with it. And so anyway, Constantine did not invent Christianity, but I do hold the position that Christianity was hijacked to a great degree at that point. And all these different, even the following ecumenical councils. Now, these ecumenical councils were where they got a bunch of bishops from churches abroad, brought them together to define dogmas. And so, Christianity was, before then, they would hold local councils. Things were a lot more decentralized, but this was a time where, like I said, they made these formulas and doctrines, which, like I say, are not necessarily bad in itself. The definitions aren't necessarily bad. It's just the fact that it was enforced and imposed on the rest of Christendom. That's where I have the issue at. And again, this is not a creation of Christianity, but this was a hijacking and a co-opting. And, and they had other ecumenical councils that followed Nicaea. Nicaea was 325 AD. Then there were other ones as well that, like I said, it wasn't the bishops calling these councils together. It was the Roman emperors. It was the ruling class that did that. And in my opinion, that's quite problematic. But again, I do want to clarify, this was not a creation of Christianity. It was a hijacking. So that's one of the things that I wanted to respond to what David Icke, and I've heard a lot of other people say that as well. Oh, Christianity was created by Constantine in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea. No, Christianity was established by Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, and he appointed his apostles to be the leaders of the church, go and establish churches, teach about the salvation, teach about the gospel, the good news, about the work of Christ on the cross and his resurrection. And that's what they did. And like I said, we have all the documentation going from the early church fathers, going all the way back to the times of the apostles, the men that were taught by Jesus himself. And it's there for us to read. We have them, thank God, the writings of the early church fathers. And I'm not saying that the early church fathers were infallible and inerrant and perfect. They were men, they were fallible. But, they did the best they could. And there's a lot of good stuff. But they are witnesses that go all the way back to the times of the apostles. That's what makes them so special. And, and this goes to show that Christianity did not spawn from the Bible. The Bible wasn't written and then Christianity just became a religion from that book. The religion was, I don't even like to use religion because religion's been turned into a bad word, unfortunately. But the way, that's what the book of Acts refers to it as, the way. The good news about Jesus Christ. Christ established, came down and taught, and his followers wrote down what they were taught, and we have writings from men who were taught by those men. And, so that's what I wanted to explain about where I had issues with David Icke on this. And like I said, I am disappointed. There's a lot of stuff that he's written, a lot of things he's talked about that I do recommend. But, man, he is really, when it comes to talking about the Bible and Christianity, he really doesn't really know much about what he's really talking about. So anyway, I'll go ahead and end the video here. Folks, take care. Have a good day.